Okay. Before we get started, I want to go over like what's going to happen tonight, right? So tonight, obviously, I'm going to post the solutions for Scope like usual, and then you still have access to all of the workshops, so you could review all the questions again as much as you want over the weekend. But tonight, I'm also going to be posting the pre-readings for every lecture next week. Okay. So arrays and objects. So take a look at those if you want to. I highly recommend taking a look at them. Okay. Also, next week, I think. Tuesday, I'll open up the workshop for your first project, the optional project that you don't have to do, okay? But I recommend doing that as well, okay? And you'll learn more about that next week. So that's the story. So, you guys want to see some questions, right? I'll do only one first because that one's pretty short and pretty straightforward, right? So, let me turn the lights on. So, only one Jesus Christ. So, if this function was to return true, that means each of these arguments, if they were all coerced into booleans, it would either look like this, this, or that. Only one of the arguments can be true for this function to return true. So, otherwise, we'll just return false, no matter what, because these are the only three possibilities. So, this is actually more simple than some of you might have originally thought when you started solving the problem. It's actually more simple. So, if we know that this is true, right? These three statements, at least one of them has to be true. So let's start by checking if the first statement is true, right? So if arg1, that's all you really needed to do to see if arg1 is true. Because if statements coerce anything inside of them into booleans, true or false, right? So if arg1 was a truthy value, arg1 would be coerced into true. So now, how do you check if arg2 and arg3 are false? There's a certain operator that shows you the inverse of its truthiness, and that would be the bang, right? And the way to do that all in one sentence is to use and. So this statement says if arg1 is truthy and also arg2 is falsy. If that is true, then we will run the if statement. Okay? And the reason we use and is because both of these statements have to be true. If we did or here, if we did a bunch of ors, and arg1 was true, then this would be true. But if arg2 was actually true, and inverse arg2 is false, right? Then this statement would still be true, because it's this one or the other one, right? So if this one is true, it's not even going to register the other value. It's just going to say, okay, we already got one, so that's what it is. It's truthy. But we do the and here, and then we also can do another and say bang arg3. And if this statement is true, we can just return true. And that's handled the first case. So, is anyone confused about this? Cool. And if you can anticipate a pattern, if that's how we do true, false, false, how can we look for false, true, false? How can we look and see if only the second argument is truthy, right? It's kind of the same thing. And you don't need an else if statement. You could write one, but you can also just do 3 separate if statements. And the reason is because first we check if this statement is true. And if it is, return. If you return a value, the function just stops running, okay? You don't want, and this is all we need to do in the function. We don't have to do anything after, okay? So we could just say this if statement, if this is true, return it. If this isn't true, it'll just skip over it and continue running the code for the rest of the function. So, in this if, we could do bang arg1. Because now we're checking to see if arg1 is false. So in this statement, if arg1 was false, this if statement would run, right? Because not false is true, correct? So if we do bang arg1 and just regular old arg2 and bang arg3, we can also just return true. Because this statement will return true if arg1 is false, arg3 is false, but arg2 is true. Any questions so far? And if you could figure out what the last one will be, it's going to be this. If, what am I doing? If bang arg1 and bang arg2 and arg3 return true. And now, if our code is running, and this for some reason was false, this for some reason was false, and this for some reason is false, we know we checked all of the 3 possible scenarios, so here we could just return false. So if we do only one of false, false, true, we get true. If this was a false, we get false. If this was a 1, this was null, and this was 2, we get false. Because no matter what the value is, the bang operator and if statement will just coerce everything into a Boolean. And the reason why arg1 without a bang operator is being coerced into a Boolean actually, it's because and checks for truthiness, right? And it will return the last truthy value or the first falsy value. If arg1 is falsy, it will return that value. This statement will be that value, and then the if statement will coerce it into false. But if it's true, and bang arg2 is true, and bang arg3 is true, it returns bang arg3. Bang arg3 is true. Does everyone understand? Can I move on to 0 dark 30? Cool. I feel like this one is just a little tricky, like, I guess logic-wise, if you're not familiar with using ands and ors and stuff. But once you get it down, you see it's a little bit more simple than you originally thought. So 0 dark 30. So this question, I believe, is they give you a number. They want you to remove all the zeros and return that same number. Well, this sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds like, how do you even do this? A good way to approach a problem like this is like, okay, so you have a number up here, right? Let's say you have like 10,001. So what the output should be is 11, right? But you can't iterate through an integer. You can't iterate through a number. So a very if you know, but you know you want to, right? You know you want to check every single digit in the number. And if you want to iterate through a number, just make it a string, right? Because you can loop through strings because strings have indexes. So, function, 0 dark 30 will take a num. So where to start? So I think it asks you if the number is 0 to return not a number, right? So that just sounds like I just literally said what you should do. If num is equal to 0, return NaN. We just handled that case right then. This actually isn't needed, but it saves time for the end. Because at the, I'll just show it. I'll go through it. I'll show you. So now we are going to say, we are going to change what this is. We're going to change what num is. And we can reassign arguments. We can reassign parameters inside of functions. We could say num is now equal to empty string plus num. This is another way to coerce something into a string without using the global string. Okay? I do this all the time. I rarely use the global string operator, you know? If you just do empty string plus num, whatever the value of num is, will be now a string. Okay? Who's confused? Cool. Yeah? Yeah? So, do you agree? No, it's cool. So do you agree that this will take whatever num is and make it a string? Do you agree that 10 plus 10 will be a string of 1010? Because if you add anything to a string, JavaScript coerces the thing that isn't a string into a string. So if I remove this 10, and it's an empty string, if you add anything to it, it's just going to be a string. It's not going to, it's like putting these things to the back of the string. But since there isn't actually any characters, there aren't actually any characters in here, it's just going to be whatever this is. So we can take that logic and make num a string. Cool? Cool. So now we are going to do this. We're going to say new string. Set that equal to an empty string. And the reason I know to do this is because I know what we don't want to do is we don't want to alter the thing that we are looping in, right? We don't want to like delete characters from a string that we're already doing. So instead, we can go through num, and then if we see something that is not a 0, we can just put it into new string. And if it is a 0, we just won't. Do you guys agree that new string will now be the same number without zeros, but in string form? Is anyone confused by that logic? You sure? Okay. So now we could just do a for loop for let I equals 0. I is less than num.length I plus plus. So we're going to loop through num, which is now a string, and then we're going to do an if statement. If num at I is equal to 0, no, if it's not equal to 0, my bad. If it's not equal to 0, we're going to say new string plus equals num of I. Does everyone understand what this loop is going to be doing? Huh? Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah. Good catch. Because we're looping through a string, so we have to check and make sure that the 0 is a string itself. If you put the number, then it would just push everything in. Or, you could use the double equals, but like So we're going to loop through the string that's a number, check to see that it's not a 0. So if it's a 1 through 9 number, or a period character, it will be put into this new string. Otherwise, it just skips this if statement and continues the loop. You could even do this, write continue, and put it outside of the if statement. Right? This is the same thing. But it's an extra line of code, so I usually don't do something like that. Make sense? Okay. So now new string should be what we want, so we could just return number of new string. So if we do 0 dark 30 of 10,001, oh shit, what happened?
It's not equal.
Oh yeah, that's my bad. I never changed that back. So we get 11. And if we see, we can do console.log type of whatever this thing spits back at us, and you see that it's a number. And you also see that doing this will return a number as well, and the results will be 1.1. Because a decimal, a string that's 1 period 1, 1.1 is a valid number. So capital number, the global number object, will coerce that into a valid number. So if we put 0 in here only, we will get not a number. But the thing is, I don't like about this is, what if we put 3 zeros in here? We also get not a number. But if you delete this, we also get not a number. Oh no, we got 0. Why? Oh, is this is 0? Oh, okay. Never mind. You do need this. But wait, what is Oh, cool. All right. Yeah, I mean that makes sense, but I just didn't think it would work. All right, whatever. Cool. Any questions on this? Seriously, be honest with me. Does anyone have questions on this problem? You guys done work? Yeah.
So the return number new string.
Yeah.
For some reason in my code, when I put it there, it doesn't work. But if I put it at before the brace above it, it works.
That shouldn't be the case. I would love to take a look at your code after and help you debug it. But there might be like an extra rank brace. We'll figure it out. Any other questions? Because then we're going to dive into scope. Scope isn't like you're going to be learning new like keywords to use in your code and stuff. This is more of a conceptual lesson, but it's very, very important that you understand how scope works. Okay? So you guys ready for some scope? Some scope. Scope. Okay. So, what is scope? Scope is literally what variables can be accessed by your code at a specific specific place. What does this mean? So this means that some variables actually aren't available to other parts of your code depending on where they're declared. If you declare something out here, let's say let Earth equals I am in global scope, this variable Earth will be available to anything else written on this page. That's because it is in the global scope. Global scope is also sometimes referred to as window, the window scope, okay? Global scope is the highest level. There is no scope further up besides the global scope in your application, okay? There are 3 types of scope. So if that one's global, we have another one that's local scope or functional scope. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's say we have a function that's called local, right? And in here, we're going to define a variable that says let neighbor equal to I am in local scope. And then inside here, I'm going to write an if statement. No, I'm going to just do this first. So I'm going to console.log neighbor, and then I'm going to console.log neighbor. And also, to prove my point before, right before I console.log neighbor in this function, I will console.log Earth. And then out here, I will also console.log Earth. But before that, I will call local. Does everyone understand what this code should be doing? I made a variable Earth, and then I made a function local. Inside function, I'm declaring a variable neighbor. Then inside, after that, I will console.log Earth, and I will console.log neighbor. So I'm calling this function on line 57, and then on line 58, I'm also going to be console.logging Earth, and also console.logging neighbor. So what we should get would be 2 Earths, 1 neighbor, and 1 error. I am in global scope. I am in local scope. Then we hit line 58. I am in global scope. Reference error. It says neighbor is not defined. But wait, we define neighbor here. It doesn't matter. Right now, out here, we are working in the global scope. When you're trying to look for variables, you can't go down further into more specific scope. You can only look up. That's why inside of the function local, it has access to Earth. If this is what actually happens. When we call local on line 57, when we run it, it goes, okay, I'm going to make this thing neighbor, and then it's going to say console.log Earth. Then JavaScript's going to say, what is Earth? What is that? That is not a type. That is not anything. So we have to find out what it is. It looks for this variable's definition inside of its local scope. If it can't find it, it goes up. It goes 1 scope up. And 1 scope up is the global scope. So it looks inside the entire application, and it's here. So then, after local's done running, we console.log Earth. Earth is defined up here. So that's fine, okay? It's in the same scope. However, neighbor is nowhere in the global scope. It is only in the functional scope. So it cannot be reached. Because you can't go down, you have to go up. Does that make sense? Is anyone confused by that logic? It's not real logic, it's just like a rule, you know? Yeah.
Constant let adjust the scope issues. Like if I put constant let.
Constant let, no. var, I will go into something with var in a second. So there's another kind of scope, the third kind, and that's called block scope. So local scope is functional scope, right? Because there's a little bit more to it than just this, well, I will also show you in a second. But block scope refers to anything that has blocks, right? The curly braces, if statements, for loops, while loops. Anything defined inside of those will also be in its own scope. So if I say if true, right? So this is always going to run. And I say let blocky equal I am a block. And then I could console log these things here. But I'll try and console.log blocky here. And I will just not do that. And I will not do these. Okay? Do you want me to delete these or leave them in comments? Is it too good? Cool. So now, the function's changed a little bit. After we define neighbor, we have an if statement. If true, so that means it will always run, right? We define another variable, blocky. Then we console log earth inside of the if statement, and we console log neighbor inside of the if statement. Then, outside of the if statement, we will console log blocky. So on line 60 now, over here, when I run this code, we get another error. But you see that global, I am in the global scope and I am in the local scope, actually ran. Because like I said, if you can't find something in your own block scope, it just goes up. It found neighbor, but it still needs to find earth. So it will go up again. It keeps going up until it hits the global scope. As soon as you hit the global scope, there is no more up. So that's how you get the error. Any questions? Yes. Cool. I hope you guys really get this, okay? But now what I was saying is that I think like if this was var, you do get I in block. And that is why var, I think, is considered buggy, okay? It ignores block scope. So this can actually cause a lot of problems in your application, unless you really, really know what you're doing, you know? Unless you know specifically, like, this data is coming in here, and it will always be doing this, and then this is always, whatever. This can cause problems. Let prevents that problem, okay? It just throws you an error saying, hey, you're trying to access something in a lower scope. It's just not defined. If this was const, it's the same thing as let. Okay? Cool. Before we go into the slides, I want to show you something else. Because the slides kind of do a better job explaining this than I do probably. So let's say we're going to talk more about local scope, functional scope, because that is has a little bit more to it than what the truths that I just told you, right? You can only access variables in your own scope or the scope above, not below. But this is going to be weird now, okay? So let's say I have a function that's called which hobbit. This which hobbit is going to take hobbit1 as a parameter. So that means that I'm going to pass in something to this function, okay? Then we will console.log hobbit1, whatever that is. Then we are going to write another function inside of this function. And we are going to say other hobbit and this will take in Hobbit 1. Wait, did I do something weird? Aha. Cool. So now we have another function called other Hobbit inside of which Hobbit? This is fine. I can do this, right? Why not? Because this is confusing. But like, why wouldn't I do this? You know? So let's say this one also took a parameter that's also called Hobbit 1. And in here, we console.log Hobbit 1. Okay? And up here, I will say let Hobbit 2, and I'm going to set that equal to Frodo. Okay? This is just a function definition. Nothing is happening. If I press enter, nothing is going to happen. It's just going to spit out undefined because it's going to run this page and look for something, but JavaScript just returns undefined if you don't return anything, right? So, this is just the function. Which Hobbit takes something, and then it defines Hobbit 2 as a string Frodo. Then it console logs whatever is the thing that we passed in. But then here's another function definition, right? And that's called other Hobbit. Other Hobbit takes something else that's called Hobbit 1, and it's going to console log Hobbit 1. And down here, I'm going to run other Hobbit with Hobbit 2. So what is going to happen if I pass in Bilbo? What will be console logged at line 66, and what will be console logged at line 68? This is confusing, right? You get Bilbo, and then you get Frodo, okay? You don't get Bilbo twice. Let me walk you through and tell you exactly what's happening. Reading. Oh, a function invocation. We're invoking something. So it needs to know what this value is going to be, right? This is an action telling JavaScript to do something. So it looks for which Hobbit, finds it, and then since we passed in this string Bilbo, Hobbit 1 here is now Bilbo. Okay? Everyone understands that, right? Then we're reading, and then, okay, we define Hobbit 2 to be Frodo. Then we console log Hobbit 1. What is Hobbit 1? Exactly, and boom, you get it right there. Then, okay, we see a function definition. Okay, forget it. Just forget that for a second, because nothing's actually being executed. Then, we are calling this function here, but we're passing in Hobbit 2, which is Frodo. And we're deciding to call this Hobbit 1, which is fine, because it is in a different scope. Okay? Whenever you access something that's the same word, it's the same variable, like I said 5 minutes ago, you look at your local scope, you look at your own scope first. So in this function, when you say console log Hobbit 1, it's like, what is Hobbit 1? I have to look and see where that is. Hobbit 1 was defined here as a parameter. And since we called it with Hobbit 2, which was Frodo, that's why we get Frodo. It doesn't look up over here. If we removed this parameter, then you would get Bilbo twice. Because even if you throw something into a function, I can throw a million things into that function. When I define the function, I'm not accounting for any arguments. So those arguments will just be lost. Nothing will happen. However, the function is still going to run, and it's going to look for what Hobbit 1 is. It can't find it. It doesn't know what Hobbit 1 is. It's not in this local functional scope of other Hobbit. So, it's going to look up 1. Up 1 scope is which Hobbit? And here is Hobbit 1 as the parameter here. So that's why you get build. Any questions? Like I said, this is more of like a conceptual lesson than something that you guys need to like remember to use like another keyword or something. But you do have to realize how these things are working. Okay? And it will always make sense if you think to yourselves, looking at your own scope first, then up one, you hit global, then you're done. I just try to make that rhyme. That's my bad. I'll never do that again, I promise. But yeah, because that's the single truth. Okay? So if you try to access something that isn't defined in that scope or anything above it, you'll get an error. That's the main lesson, okay? Okay. So now I will show you the slides. Any other question on anything? Definitely review this weekend. Because next week is like all new stuff. Next week is arrays for 2 days, and then objects for 2 days, and those are very different. Okay? Okay. Scope. So we're going to talk about what is scope. We're going to talk about types of scope, global, functional, and block. And we will also talk about functions and hoisting. I didn't go over this before, but I will in the lecture, okay? And then we'll talk about scope best practices. So what is scope? Scope refers to which variables can be accessed by your code at a specific location in your code. So if you say let wow equals wow, and you console log wow, you get wow. Wow, right? That's crazy. That's just how it works, right? Even though a global variable can be referenced from anywhere in your code, the value assigned to the variable cannot be accessed until after the assignment operation occurs. Wait for it, let wait for it, I am here I am, console.log wait for it. Here you get undefined, and here you get here I am. So, if you try this in REPL, this won't work. This will throw an error using the let key, okay? Just for your information. However, the reason why this happens is because, and the reason why this happens here, it returns undefined and doesn't throw an error, because this is what would happen in like a regular application. It's because of hoisting, okay? And I didn't go into what hoisting was yet. I'll do that in a little bit, okay? And it'll make more sense. But if you want that variable, make sure you're console logging after you define it. If you want the value, that's a fact, okay? And that makes sense, right? Because JavaScript reads every line once at a time. One at a time. You know? So variables declared inside of a function are locally scoped, and they cannot be referenced outside of the function. I showed you this, right? This makes sense. When we try to console log neighbors outside of that function, we got a reference error, because this just doesn't exist in the global scope, and you can't go down. So if we have this function, happy function, and we have let message equal I am so happy, and we console log the message inside of this function, when we call happy function, we should get I am so happy, right? Console logged here. But if we console log message outside of the function, here on line 11, we get a reference error. Message is not defined. It doesn't know what message is, because you can't go into, you can't penetrate the scope. You can only go out. You can't go in. Get it? This makes sense, right? A little bit? Cool. What if a variable is defined locally and globally? let message equal think globally. And then you write a function that says log message, okay? So this function will define another message, act locally. JavaScript will look for message locally first. So when you console log message here and you run log message, you get act locally. And if you deleted this line, you would get think globally. Does that make sense? You look at your own scope first, then you go out. Stop me if anybody is confused at any point. Okay, cool. What if a variable is defined? If it can't find it locally, JavaScript will look at the scope outside of the function. In this case, the global scope. So like I just said, this is what happens, right? Because here, we say let MSG equal act locally. But if we're console logging message, this is a different variable than this, right? So it'll look for it in the function. There is no message variable. So it goes out into the global scope and finds it here. And that's where we get think globally from. Yeah?
What is the line search means longer message?
Log a message is just it's just invoking this function.
Okay.
The function's called log a message. So then we define it here, right? Log a message, and then we call it here. So the function runs. This is defined inside of this function, and then this console log statement is running for message. It looks for a message in here, can't find it. It sees there's another scope that's an outer scope. It looks in that outer scope, and it finds something called message here. If this was called MSG as well, then you would get a reference error, because there is no message variable anymore. Does that make sense?
If you have like a message, if you have like assigned the message outside of, as a global and a local, what gonna happen? Is there gonna be an error?
So if you define message here, if you define message here and then also message here, it's going to log out act locally here. Because it looks at this first, it looks at its own scope first to see what the variable is. When you like use variables in functions to like make equations, variables aren't values, right? They store values. They have values inside of them. So when you pass a variable into a console log statement, the console log statement needs to know what exactly it's going to be printing. So it looks and sees where that variable is. So first it looks at its own scope. And its own scope, since it lives inside of log a message, is its own local scope. So it looks here, it sees it here, it logs it out. It doesn't look up here. You can define message here and here with no error because they're in different scopes. Yeah.
And they won't miss each other.
No. If you remove the let keyword here, then that would now equal this. Does that make sense? That's kind of how we've been doing it with for loops, right? Like, whenever, in 0 to 30, right? We're looping through that string that's a number, but the new string is outside of the for loop, and we keep reassigning it.
But that will only happen in that scope, right?
What do you mean?
You said that if you take the let out, the message now is equal to sync global.
That will be reassigning this message. If you take this let out.
But that only happens in that scope from the.
Well, that will happen anywhere.
Oh.
You know, because this is in the global scope, right? Right?
Yes.
And you know anything block or function can just look up and up and up until it finds something. And if it's in the global scope, it'll have access to that number, right? So if you just say let message equal think globally, and anywhere in your program, if you don't define message again in a block, and you just say message equals this, then this is going to be altered. This value will now be different for the rest of your program. That's why it's not good practice to define global variables. Okay? Sure. I'll show you what I mean. So like so we have Mars a bunch of times here, right? If you guys were paying attention while I was writing this function, it's a function that's called global. Inside of global, there's just a for loop, right? Regular for loop. Setting I to 0, looping as long as I is less than 5, and adding 1 to I at the end of the loop, right? Inside of the for loop, we say let Earth equal to a string called Mars. But you see above this function, I said let Earth equal to a string called Earth. I can do this here because this is in its own block scope, within its own functional scope, right? Like if I still did this, it's still going to be Mars. Because the console log statement is going to look inside, of its own scope first. But if I console log outside of the for loop, Earth, oh shit, we get Jupiter, right? Because this can't look down and see what Earth is here, but Earth is defined here, right? So let me just change this to 3 really quick to make there less Mars, you know? Can't too much Mars, you know? Let's say I did this. I removed the let statement. There is no longer going to be a Jupiter. Because you're saying you're looping through every time, and you're just saying, okay, Earth is Mars. Okay, wait a second. JavaScript's like, what? What is Earth? It's not in here anymore because you're not declaring anything, right? You're not saying let Earth. You're saying whatever Earth is, it is now Mars. And it's not in this for loop in its own block scope, so it looks a scope up into the function scope. And it sees that Earth here is Jupiter. So now it's Mars. So we loop through it, it just gets reset as Mars every time, the string Mars, and then when we console log it here, it's going to be Mars. But if you console log Earth out here, yeah. Before all that, we get Earth and then Mars, Mars, Mars. But if we move this down here, we still get the same thing. Mars, 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 Earth. But if we deleted this up here, we just get a bunch of Marses. Because this is reassigning this variable. Now let's say I had other functions written below this one that needed this to be Earth. That's why having global variables available are a little dangerous. Does that make sense? The difference between declaring something and reassigning something? Yeah.
So all of here is just like
Yeah. Because if I put let here, that's saying we're declaring a new variable called Earth, and you can do that because this is in a lower scope than this, in a different scope than this. If I try to say let Earth here, that would throw an error. Because variables have to be unique in their own scope. Cool? Dope. All right. thing takes so long to start. Okay. So functional scope is defined locally. Oh, I did this. Yeah, if it can't find it locally, JavaScript will look at the scope outside the function, in this case, the global scope. Did this. Parameters, so this is now we'll get into how parameters get thrown into all of this stuff, besides just defining variables and functions. Parameters are also locally scoped. So let message equal think globally. But then we have a function that says log a message, and we're going to call its parameter the same thing. And then we're just going to console log message, and then we're going to call log a message and pass in a different string, act locally. So we get act locally. Because here we are looking for what message is in its own scope before going up. And it finds it because it's the parameter. Parameters are included in this logic, okay? Is anyone confused by that? Talk to me. Yeah.
So if you didn't define act locally there, would it only go one up and get the message think global?
No. It will print undefined. Because what? Exactly. So like you can write in your code let message and not assign it anything, right? That's fine. You're just declaring this variable and not giving it. You're not defining it. So its value is undefined. So if you were to just console log, if you didn't pass anything in here, this thing still has a value. That value is undefined. As long as this is here, this will always be referring to this. If the parameter was gone, this will always refer to that. Make sense? Consider nested functions. I showed you an example of a nested function. When I say nested, I mean something inside of something else. So let global var equal global, right? And we have a function outer. We have a function outer. Let's see what's happening inside of outer, right? Line by line. So let outer var equal outer. It's just declaring another variable called outer var and setting it to a string. Then we have the function keyword. That means we are defining a new function, and you can do that inside of functions. You can even define a new function inside of this function. It doesn't matter. You can do that if you wanted to. So now we're defining a new function called inner, and we're kind of doing the same thing as this, except now we're saying let inner var equal inner. So, and inside the function inner, we're going to console log global var, outer var, and inner var. And then at the end of, now we exit the function here, right? So that's function inner. This is just a definition. So then we continue outer, and that's when we invoke inner. So then, when we call outer, we get global outer inner. Is anyone confused by that? Be honest with me. Because I don't think you guys have written functions inside of functions before, so it may look a little weird. But if you just like remove this and this, function is just, inner is just a regular function, right? So you could just like take that and put it inside another function. What do you think would happen if you tried to call inner out here? You'd get a nasty error saying inner is not a function, because inner was defined inside of outer. Does that sink in yet? Is that okay? Okay. Stop me at any time. So now let's look at this example. So we have a variable up here that says let collision equals global. Cool. Then we have the function keyword, so we know we're defining a function. Function outer is going to take something that's called collision, and then what are we going to do? Oh, there's another function keyword, so before anything happens, we have to define another function called inner. And inside of inner, we're going to define, okay, let collision equal inner. That's weird. So then we're going to console log collision. What is going to happen if this function were ever to run? Oh, I guess we'll find out because inner is being invoked at the end of outer. So then when we call outer and we pass in outer, what we get is inner. That makes sense, right? Because the console log statement is console logging what this variable collision is, and the first place it looks is within itself. And there is something there that is called collision. If you deleted line 7, it would be outer. If you didn't pass in outer, it would be global. Does that make sense? Yeah? Yeah.
Okay, so if you didn't pass it outer, it would be global.
If you deleted line 7 and did not pass in outer, it would be global.
Yeah, okay.
And if you deleted line 7 and didn't pass in outer and then deleted line 2, it would be a reference error. Because there is no collision. Makes sense, right? It looks in itself first, then it goes out slowly until it finds something of the same name. I'm going to move on. Jesus. Oh, this is showing you what I just said. If we deleted line 7, there is a line 7, but like what was there before was we're defining collision before and setting it to inner. But now since that's gone, it looks and sees what collision is. It's not inside of this function inner that's only 3 lines. So then it looks to the outer scope. And that outer scope is the local scope of outer. And here we have collision. And that's what we get. Because collision is outer. Because that's what we pass into outer. Oh my god. Aha. So, like I said before, if we didn't throw this in, this would be global, right? This would also happen, this would also be global if we just didn't put in a parameter. If we delete the parameter, whatever we pass into outer will just never be accounted for inside of this function. It doesn't matter. You can pass in like 30,000 things, outer won't look at them because they're not going to be captured anywhere. So, console log collision looks inside inner, can't find it, goes out 1, looks inside outer, can't find it. That's weird. So let's go out to the global scope, and that's why we get global. Cool? Note the inner function can access the scope of the outer function, but the opposite is not true. So when we console log inner var here, this is the same function as before, sort of. We have function outer, we define outer var as outer. Then we have function inner inside of outer. And we say let inner var equal inner. And then we console log outer var inner var. And we get outer inner, right? Because when we call outer, we're actually invoking inner. But then after we invoke inner, we're going to console log inner var inside of outer. Inner var is defined inside of inner. So you get a reference error. Because you can't go down into scope, you can only go up. Okay? The inner function still looks for a local declaration of the variable name before looking at the next level of the scope. Yes. So this happens because you passed in, you're saying inner is supposed to take a variable called outer. Somebody asked me this question before when I was demoing. And if we try to console log outer var, this is undefined because you never assigned it a variable. You didn't pass anything into it. And it might look like you are because you're saying let outer var equal outer var, but you're not actually throwing that in here at this point, right? You're not passing anything here. You have to pass in the variable when you invoke inner. This is just a function definition. This means you're defining that there will be a variable being passed into function inner, and in here it will be referred to as outer var. But if you don't pass anything into that, this is going to be undefined. Cool? So block scope I went over quickly because it's kind of the same logic as everything else. Any block of code inside of curly brackets, creates its own scope too. So if we say if true, let block equal Jenny from the, and then we console log block, and then the string block. So you get Jenny from the block. But if you try and console log block outside of the if statement, you get the reference error, because that was never defined in the global scope. It was defined in the block scope of the if statement. Cool? The pre-ES6 error. The var keyword ignores block scope, and I showed you guys that. This actually works, and this can cause problems. Okay? This is problematic. So now we will talk about hoisting very quickly. You can run this function even though it's defined on the lower line. That is because of hoisting. So variables and function declarations are actually moved to the top when you're executing code. Hoisting means that before you're going to run all of your code, I think the compiler actually goes through every line and looks for the declaration keywords and the function. Okay? And so it puts into memory, like if you say like let earth equals earth, before you run your code, the computer will actually say, okay, there's something called earth, I'm going to put that in memory, and I'm going to set it equal to undefined. Oh, and it function. And then you see the function, but the function doesn't get set to undefined. The function gets set to what it is. And that's why functions are a little special with hoisting. Okay? And that's why this works. Like before I showed you, if there was a variable, and you try to console log that variable before it was defined, but it still gets defined in the same scope, you don't get an error, you just get undefined. Because hoisting actually does that stuff for you. Any questions on that? Hoisting is like a broader term, for sure. But that's essentially what happens. If you were to say, have you guys noticed sometimes when I write functions, I say const, the name of the function, is equal to open parens, fat arrow, and then curly braces, right? You guys have seen that? If I were to do that, this would not work. Because I'm saying this variable is going to be equal to something. So when you hoist, it's going to set it to undefined, right? Because you're saying you're using a declaration keyword. If you said let const or var, that would happen. But if you define a function using the special function keyword, then you can do it like this. Yeah.
Do nested functions get hoisted as well, or just
No. Like if you had a function inside of here and you try to call it outside here, you just can't have it. You just define somewhere else, right? Because of scope. Functions defined with let or const can only be run after the line on which they were defined. Oh, I just said this. This won't work because you're calling this, but when it's hoisted, will this work is actually being set to undefined. will this work is undefined when you try to invoke it. So you get type error, will this work is not a function. I actually like this type error because usually that happens to me when I misspell something. So then I see it right away. I'm like, oh. But yeah, this is what happens if you try to do the function. And you can also define a function like this, right? With no name like that. So best practices for scope. Functions generally should not change globally scoped variables. So I mean, yeah, you can have global scope functions if you really need to. I don't recommend like writing them, but really, if you need to, don't have your function change that value. Okay, just best practice. I mean, yeah, you can. You can do whatever you want. I'm not going to tell you not to because you can do whatever you want. But like, if you get it, the reason I'm telling you these best practices is to make sure you don't get into like bad habits of doing them, you know? Because later when you're writing big things, like big functions, and you're already in this weird habit from bootcamp prep, and it's my fault, then I'll feel really sad, you know? You don't want that habit when you're working with bigger data, so just really like don't really define global variables if you don't need to. And definitely don't change them, especially if they're being used somewhere else. Like if we say let always true is true, and our application, our application needs this to be true, but then this function don't mind me just casually sets always true to false, then we call don't mind me, and then somewhere else down the line, we say if always true, console log all is well, else throw a new error, everything is broken. You know? This can cause problems. This is a very simple scenario, but like this could cause big problems. Oh, like new error? Yeah, there's a global error. You know how there's a global string and number object and a Boolean object? There's also a global array object and a global object, and also a global error object. So if you ever wanted to like stop your program from running for some reason and like console log what it is, you could say throw new error and then pass in like a string. You know? If you know specifically what the error is going to be, you could do that. Throw is another keyword. If you put throw in, it usually just stops your function, and usually it's for an error. You don't really put throw in for other things, really, I think. I don't anyway. So this is fine, because if you see the difference, always true is equal false, is now let always true equals false. This is saying we're defining a new variable inside of don't mind me, called always true, and it's just going to be equal to false. It's not reassigning that, okay? So that's fine. Avoid cluttering the global namespace with lots of variables, and only declare variables globally if they need to be accessed globally, okay? Otherwise, it's safer to declare variables in functions or blocks so you don't overwrite variables accidentally, or access the wrong variable by mistake. Both likely sources of bugs, for sure. So a recap, we talked about scope, global, local, and block. We talked a little bit about hoisting and how functions are hoisted a little bit, and best practices. Are there any final questions before you take the break?
Can you go over page 20 one more time?
Page 20? I don't know. Oh, there's numbers on the bottom. I was like, I don't know what page 20 is.
So it's so this one, if we console log it, it goes back all as well.
Yes. Because if always true, right? So that means the if statement will coerce whatever this is into a Boolean, whatever it is, right? So then JavaScript says, okay, what is always true? Let's find that value. It looks in its own scope, and it finds it here, right? But before this if statement is run, we ran don't mind me. But since this let keyword is here, don't mind me does not reassign this value. Don't mind me declares a new value within its own functional scope. It's just going to be called the same thing, and you can do that. It is confusing, and I actually really strongly recommend you not to just create a bunch of variables with the same name throughout all of your if statements, you yourself will just get confused as a programmer. So I just don't recommend doing that. But you can. Sometimes it makes sense to. So yeah. So does that make sense? Sure. Cool. Any other final questions? Cool. Take like a 5-minute break, okay? At 7:55, I'll slack out pairs.